Racist cops held a gun to a black man's head. Then the federal task force stormed in. They handcuffed a female Navy SEAL sniper right in the courtroom, unaware that just minutes later, a Vice Admiral would walk in and bring the entire system to a halt. That morning, November 14th, courtroom number 7 at the Fulton County Courthouse in Georgia was wrapped in a strange atmosphere. Quiet, heavy, as if everything was holding its breath for something about to happen. Something no one could quite name. Autumn sunlight filtered through the tall window panes, speckling the faded wooden floor. The ceiling fans creaked slowly, in sync with the tense rhythm of the room's collective breath. The scent of old paper, aged wood, and time itself lingered. Everyone present remained silent, not out of respect for the court, but because of the unusual presence of one woman. She sat at the very back of the witness stand, dark-skinned, hair neatly tied up, shoulders squared, and hands clasped on her knees. She wore a faded olive military jacket, no insignia, no rank, no unit name. Her face gave nothing away, but her eyes, those eyes did not belong to an ordinary person. They were too alert, too cold. And what unsettled everyone even more was that she sat there as if she already knew exactly what was going to happen. And they did not. Her name was Alyssa Graves, 38 years old. Some in the courtroom might have heard of that name, but very few truly understood the person behind it. They didn't know she had served with SEAL Team 6, the unit famously known as the sharpest blades in the dark. Alyssa wasn't just a SEAL. She was a legendary sniper, the only one on the team to maintain a 92% accuracy rate from over 800 meters. Over 14 years of service, she had completed 39 special operations, including the 2013 hostage rescue in Kandahar and the 2015 raid on a terrorist camp near the Pakistani border. She had once taken 2 bullets protecting her team leader during an ambush, both bullets still lodged in her chest to this day. But no one in that courtroom knew any of this, because Alyssa hadn't come to flaunt her medals. She came with one purpose: to serve as the key witness in the trial of Police Chief Kyle Benson, who had been accused of assaulting an unarmed black man on the streets of Atlanta. Alyssa had witnessed the entire event by chance and agreed to testify. But ever since her name appeared on the witness list, things within the local system had started to shift. Police Chief Benson sat across from her on the defendant's side. He wore civilian clothes, but kept his badge clipped to his belt, a silent reminder of the power he believed he still held. His eyes were openly hostile, and the corner of his mouth curled into a mocking smirk. To him, this woman was just another pawn, a former soldier clinging to past glory, grasping at justice in a system he had manipulated for decades. What Benson didn't know was that Alyssa Graves needed no title. She didn't need recognition. All she needed was the truth, and if that truth was obstructed today, it would still come out. In a way he never saw coming, because somewhere else, exactly 93 miles away, a man in a 3-star uniform had just received an urgent signal from the watch on Alyssa's wrist. And he was already en route to Fulton, inside an unmarked SUV, accompanied by 12 others, bringing with them a storm that was about to strike this seemingly quiet courtroom. The incident occurred precisely at 9:11 a.m. The courtroom door number 7 remained closed, but something had changed. The earlier atmosphere, once merely tense and uncertain, had now taken on a menacing tone. Alyssa's attorney, Jeremy Calloway, a 56-year-old white man with over 25 years of litigation experience, was stopped right at the entrance by 2 officers in dark blue uniforms. They wore no name tags, no visible indicators of rank, and they weren't polite. "We've been instructed not to let anyone inside until the session resumes," one of them said, eyes averted, voice as robotic as a recording. Jeremy froze. He knew this was a serious breach of judicial procedure. No lawyer can be denied access to the trial of their client or protected witness. But he also knew pushing too hard might send things spiraling out of control. He pulled out his phone and began recording. Inside the courtroom, Kyle Benson leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, chin tilted up. He stared at Alyssa like a predator, eyeing weakened prey. There was something in his smile that made the air turn strangely cold, as if he knew, and was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Without a sound, 2 other officers appeared from the side door behind the witness stand. They walked straight toward Alyssa, eyes steady, hands calm. Neither carried a warrant. No one read her Miranda rights, the rights every American citizen is entitled to. "Stand up. You're being detained for disrupting courtroom order." One of them spoke with a chilling tone. Alyssa looked up. She wasn't surprised, only raised an eyebrow slightly, her gaze seeming to pierce through every fiber of tension beneath their uniforms. She asked slowly, each word deliberate, "Under which section of federal law?" No one answered. The cold steel of the cuffs touched her skin, cold, rough, and humiliating. A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. An elderly woman gasped. "Is it her?" A law student seated in the back row tried to pull out his phone to record, but was silently stopped by a judicial officer whose glare cut like a blade. The judge, a middle-aged man who had presided over dozens of high-profile criminal cases, sat motionless behind the bench. He saw everything, yet said nothing. He gave no order, issued no objection. He just sat there, as though the authority of the seat beneath him had been drained without notice. Benson watched the scene unfold, like a man who had just scored the winning goal in a game he believed he controlled. He leaned toward the prosecutor and whispered, just loud enough for a few people to hear. "She never should have stepped in here to begin with. Someone like that." At that very moment, a woman who had once risked her life for the country, who had fought under skies filled with fire and bullets, who had been wounded shielding her team, was being treated like a criminal on American soil. Not for any action, not for any violation, but simply because she existed. What Kyle Benson failed to understand was that Alyssa wasn't the kind to be broken by a pair of cuffs. What was happening didn't frighten her. It simply reminded her of that time she was captured in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, when the Taliban threw a sack over her head, and she counted every second until the rescue team arrived. Only one thing was different this time. She wasn't captured by enemies. She was detained by her countrymen in a courtroom of the very nation she once swore to die for. And once again, she was counting down, the basement holding cell. 4A of the Fulton County courthouse was typically reserved for exceptional circumstances. But that morning, there was no such case. Only a woman escorted in silence through a process so arbitrary it sent chills down the spine. Her name was Alyssa Graves. She wasn't a defendant. There were no charges. She was merely a witness, and for reasons no one dared to say aloud, she was handcuffed, detained, and cut off from any form of legal protection. The light in the cell glowed from a flickering fluorescent bulb dangling from above, pulsing like the breath of a nightmare. The concrete walls were stained with deep brown blotches. The floor was tiled and cold, with no chairs. Alyssa sat, her back still straight like a flagpole in a storm, both wrists bound in cheap metal cuffs. A guard passed by, avoiding her gaze. He quietly checked the digital panel mounted on the door, tapped something on the touchscreen, and walked away without saying a word. In this system, Silence had become the most effective tool for suffocating human rights. But Alyssa didn't demand fairness. She was far too accustomed to fighting amid injustice. And now, she wasn't angry, because she knew this power game wouldn't last much longer. On her left wrist was a silver watch. Its glass surface was lightly scratched from training grounds, but the mechanism beneath still worked flawlessly. To the untrained eye, it looked like a cheap accessory, but beneath its shell was an R4X military microwave transmitter, encrypted by the United States Naval Special Warfare Command. When she was dragged from the courtroom, Alyssa had tilted her wrist exactly 37 degrees and held the rear button down for precisely 4 seconds, and the signal was sent. A burst of Alpha 1 priority encrypted data was transmitted directly to the alert system of the Joint Command Center in Virginia Beach. No sound, no flashing lights, but every location ping, every body temperature fluctuation, every beat of Alyssa's heart was now being tracked in real time. The on-duty operations commander, Major Von Liddell, saw the signal appear on the main monitor at 9:14:28 a.m. Without a moment's hesitation, he pressed the emergency contact line to Vice Admiral Eugene Marshall and said just 4 words. "It's Graves. She's pinged." At a level of power men like Kyle Benson would never comprehend, the gears had begun to turn. Not because a witness had been disrespected, but because a special operations soldier had been stripped of her citizenship rights. In that dark cell, Alyssa still didn't speak, but every fiber of her being was alert. She counted the minutes. She knew the tactical response system would take exactly 17 minutes and 40 seconds to reach Fulton after the initial signal. Everything now was just a matter of time. In the hallway above, a police officer chuckled to his colleague and said, half joking, "This chick probably thinks she's some CIA spy." No one replied, but if someone had looked down into that holding cell at that moment, they would have seen. Alyssa Graves wasn't afraid. She was simply waiting for the moment the courthouse doorbell rang, with a sound that didn't belong in the world of abusers. The first sound rang out, like thunder on a sunny day. The powerful roar of jet engines from afar, suddenly decelerating and screeching to a halt just outside the main gates of the Fulton courthouse. Tires shrieked across the pavement, leaving black rubber trails that shattered every gaze and sliced through the false peace-cloaking courtroom 7. 4 sleek black SUVs, unmarked, tinted with bulletproof windows, opened their doors in perfect unison. From each vehicle stepped out 3 individuals, 12 men and women in total. They wore black suits, white shirts, mirrored sunglasses, and military-grade earpieces. But it wasn't their appearance that made people freeze. It was the way they moved, synchronized, silent, eyes never straying from forward, forming precise triangular formations as though trained in elite tactical operations. These weren't ordinary law enforcement agents. They were federal enforcement operatives of the highest classification. At the center of the formation was a tall man, broad-shouldered and built like he'd been carved from stone. He wore a high-ranking Navy uniform, no tie. 3 silver stars gleamed on his left collar. Vice Admiral. His face was stern, his hair cropped close to the scalp, and his gray eyes never blinked. His name was Eugene Marshall, former commander of SEAL Team 6 for 7 years, and now head of the U.S. Navy's Special Warfare Command. Marshall was a living legend in the military world, the man who personally led the 2016 hostage rescue in Somalia, the man who once saved an entire platoon under gunfire in Aleppo with nothing but his bare hands. But today, he carried no weapon. What he brought was a single order: to extract a soldier betrayed by the very system she once swore to protect. The main doors of the Fulton courthouse had just been opened by security when the sound of leather shoes struck the marble floor. The entire building froze. In courtroom 7, a clerk rushed out into the hallway, only to halt in shock as the entire tactical unit advanced like a silent wave. Leading the group was a female federal legal officer in a light gray suit, holding a folder stamped in red. Urgent. DHS authority. Without hesitation, she strode straight into the courtroom where the judge and prosecutor sat in full session. Every head turned. "This hearing is immediately suspended under Emergency National Security Directive," she declared, her voice calm, clear, and slicing through the room like a bell. The judge, a man who had presided over hundreds of state-level criminal trials, leapt to his feet. "What is the meaning of this?" Vice Admiral Marshall stepped forward, locking eyes with him. "The meaning," he said slowly, "is that a federal witness has been unlawfully detained, without charge, without legal counsel, and under abuse of authority by the very enforcement body she once risked her life to defend." No one spoke. The air in the courtroom thickened, compressed under some invisible pressure. Kyle Benson, arms crossed across his chest, suddenly froze. His eyes shifted, then darted toward the rear door. Marshall continued, unblinking. "And the person you're holding in the basement, Alyssa Graves, is one of only 19 surviving special operatives from the 2015 Spearfall mission. She is the only sniper to ever receive S-level training, an elite skill set held by only 3 individuals in the entire Pentagon." Someone dropped a pen. The clink of metal hitting tile echoed like the truth striking bone. Marshall turned his head. "Bring my operative up." And just like that, from the basement below, the return began. No longer just a witness. No longer the woman in cuffs. Alyssa Graves was coming back under the very title this courtroom had tried to erase. And they were about to face consequences far greater than any sentence ever handed down. The basement door swung open without warning, cutting through the monotony of the ballpoint pen a young officer had been fiddling with between his fingers. Light from the hallway sliced into the narrow holding cell like a blade. And then he stepped in. Vice Admiral Eugene Marshall, dressed in Navy combat uniform, 3 stars pinned squarely to his chest, eyes unwavering and resolute. Alyssa Graves remained seated at the far end of the room. The dim light reflected faintly off the dust clinging to her worn military jacket. But her back stayed straight, chin lifted, as though this entire room were a training field she had walked 100 times before. There was no fear, no despair, only silence, the kind kept by someone who knows exactly what's coming. "Lieutenant Special Operator Alyssa Graves," the Vice Admiral said, his voice deep and clear like a tactical command. "I'm here to retrieve you." That sentence wasn't merely a declaration. It was a reversal of power. In seconds, the holding cell became a battlefield of honor, where the detainee was no longer the vulnerable one, but the central figure of a system now forced to serve her. The officer sitting there, young, white, maybe 30, looked stunned. He sprang up, voice stammering, Your seal." But the question didn't need answering. It was the instinctive reaction of a man realizing he had run headfirst into a wall he never saw coming. Alyssa turned her head, her voice quiet but clear in the heavy air. "You have the right not to believe, but I have the right to remain silent." The moment those words left her lips, 2 members of the tactical team entered, one brown-skinned, a security cyber ops badge on his chest, the other, a tall black man carrying a tactical laptop. They began the verification process immediately. A backup drive was connected to the wall panel. Within 90 seconds, footage from security cameras, audio from ceiling mics, and location data from the holding management system were all downloaded. Confirmed, the tech operative reported to Marshall. There was no warrant for Graves's detention, no legal documentation. The level of violation exceeds the federal enforcement red threshold. Marshall didn't nod. He didn't need confirmation. He simply looked down at the woman seated before him and gave a slight signal with his eyes. Alyssa rose to her feet unaided. The cuffs were still on her wrists, but her presence now far outstripped the metal restraints that bound her. "Uncuff her," Marshall ordered. The young officer looked down at his hands, trembling. He fumbled for the key on his belt, stepped forward, and then paused, not out of fear of Alyssa, but because Marshall's gaze sliced through the air like a blade. A gaze that had once sent platoons into occupied zones. A gaze that had delivered silent verdicts to those who dared devalue the lives of their comrades. The handcuffs fell to the floor with a metallic clink. But that sound no longer symbolized authority. It was a confession. Silent, but irreversible. Alyssa walked out of the cell, passing between two rows of special operatives. She didn't look back. But behind her, the officer stood frozen. His fist clenched, his eyes locked on her, as if still unable to believe he had just been witness, or perhaps accomplice, to one of the incidents that would shake the foundations of the local justice system. And as the tactical team escorted Alyssa upstairs, the data documenting every violation was already encrypted and transmitted directly to Washington, D.C., where the Office of Internal Oversight at the Department of Homeland Security was waiting. What happened in the Fulton courthouse basement that morning wasn't just a breach of law. It was the beginning of a political, legal, and moral reckoning. One the self-assured would not escape. The atmosphere in courtroom 7 at 10:23 a.m. that day was thick, as if a storm had just swept through, but hadn't yet cleared. The benches once reserved for the public were now packed with police officers, court staff, and a few journalists who had managed to grab seats after hearing an urgent alert. Everyone sat in silence, but it wasn't the kind born of respect. It was the silence of having just witnessed the reversal of a trial that had seemed rigged from the start. Vice Admiral Eugene Marshall stood squarely at the center of the courtroom floor, as though commanding a tactical team in a desert, not a civilian court. His expression wasn't angry, but his eyes, sharp like steel forged in fire, swept over every person in the room. "Do you," he said slowly and clearly, "have any idea who you just handcuffed?" No one answered. The judge lowered his head. The prosecutor pressed his lips tightly together. One police officer shifted as if to protest, then froze under the glance of one of the operatives behind Marshall. Everyone seemed pinned in place, not by command, but by the truth that had just been yanked from behind a veil of silence. Marshall placed a 3-inch thick folder on the evidence table. The thud of paper hitting wood cracked like a gavel against the hollow authority of those sitting on high. He tapped the dark blue cover 3 times with his finger, right above the label. Operational History, LT Alyssa Graves, SEAL Team 6. Inside here, he said, is the complete tactical record of Lieutenant Special Operator Alyssa Graves. 39 missions, 14 direct anti-terror operations in the Middle East. 3 were personally authorized by the President of the United States through executive order. Twice wounded. 1 Bronze Star was awarded for saving 5 fellow soldiers during an ambush in Mosul in 2017. And you, his voice dropped, handcuffed her like a petty thief. All eyes turned to Kyle Benson. He stood there, his usual aggressive demeanor gone. His lower lip trembled. The fire in his eyes had faded, replaced by confusion and fear. He stammered. "I didn't know. I acted on a security concern. She looked like a worker," Marshall interrupted. "Like an ordinary citizen." He stepped forward, now less than an arm's length away from Benson. "You didn't doubt her," because she was dangerous. You doubted her because she's black, because she wore old clothes, because you couldn't imagine that someone like her could carry a kind of honor you will never even be qualified to comprehend. A soft gasp came from the back row, but no one said a word. No one stood to defend him, because at this point, any excuse would only highlight the cowardice even more clearly. The Vice Admiral continued. We have evidence from security cameras, badge swipe data, and testimony from a security staff member confirming that Lieutenant Graves showed no threatening behavior. Every action taken to detain her was carried out without a warrant, without formal charges, and legal counsel present. That, under federal law, isn't just misconduct. It's a flagrant violation of civil rights and is subject to criminal prosecution. Benson said nothing more. He collapsed into the defendant's chair, head bowed, hands clenched white, not out of remorse, but because he understood, this moment, right here, is when the false authority he once wielded to suppress others crumbled. Alyssa entered the courtroom, no longer in cuffs. She wore her military jacket again, sleeves neatly adjusted. No one rose when she walked in, but every eye turned to her, as if witnessing a symbol they had tried so hard to ignore. And as she took her seat, her face unreadable, one truth had never been clearer. The fight for justice doesn't always unfold on the battlefield. It happens in the very places we assume are the safest. At 10:47 a.m., the armored vehicle door shut behind Alyssa Graves with the firm click of a mechanical lock. She sat in the back seat, hands resting on her lap, eyes fixed straight ahead. Outside, 12 Special Forces officers stood in 2 parallel lines, shoulders squared, eyes forward. No one spoke, no one moved, but in that silence echoed an unspoken vow echoed, "We stand behind you, and justice will not end here." Vice Admiral Eugene Marshall closed the vehicle door, then turned to an officer with a nameplate reading Milner, the federal enforcement lead for District 8. "Initiate emergency oversight protocol," he said, his voice not loud but weighted like a verdict. "I want every document related to the Fulton Police Department and the local judicial council gathered within the next 72 hours. Not a single page left behind." That order triggered a political earthquake no one in the local government system could stop. That afternoon, a joint team of military legal officers and FBI agents conducted a surprise inspection at the Fulton Police Department headquarters. Internal servers were sealed. Offices were cordoned off. 4 records managers were placed in isolation pending investigation. By 6 p.m. the next day, 47 civil complaints previously marked as unfounded or untraceable were reopened. Of those, 27 included video evidence or eyewitnesses, and 7 were directly tied to Kyle Benson. All involved black citizens are being pulled over, searched, or assaulted, without warrants and with no official records filed. But the story didn't end there. On the 3rd day, the first official report was completed and submitted to the Office of the Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Justice. The document spanned over 800 pages, with full appendices, security footage extracts, internal testimonies, and digital logs. One of the opening pages stated clearly, "The incident involving Lieutenant Special Operator Alyssa Graves is not an isolated case. It is a stark indicator of a systemic abuse of power enabled by silence and willful concealment across multiple layers of authority." A reporter from the New York Times, who had followed the case since the courtroom disruption, described the unfolding events as a single crack in what seemed like flawless glass. But when the light hit it, the entire pane shattered. Benson was suspended immediately, but that was far from the final reckoning. A special hearing was convened in Atlanta, with representatives from the Department of Justice, the Navy, and the Homeland Security Oversight Committee. Those who once believed their misconduct would stay hidden suddenly heard their names read aloud before Congress, along with complaint numbers, incident dates, and undeniable video excerpts. And while all of this unfolded, Alyssa stayed away from the cameras. She gave no interviews, posted nothing, and never live-streamed. She returned to base in Virginia Beach and resumed quietly training SEAL recruits. Yet her silence reverberated across the nation. On social media, the hashtag number Justice for Graves reached over 14 million shares within 48 hours. Thousands of American veterans posted videos recounting moments when the YTU had been doubted, insulted, or even assaulted simply because of their skin color, even while wearing medals earned in service to this country. The courtroom drama that day had ended, but what Alyssa left behind wasn't a disrupted trial. It was a door blown open, leading to a truth the power structure could no longer deny. Her battle was never with the man who carried the gun, but with those who carried the law in their hands and used it like a hammer against the dignity of people they did understand, or willfully refused to understand. And that battle was just beginning. That night, in a small room on the southern side of the Little Creek Naval Base in Virginia, a dim yellow light cast shadows over a wooden desk marked with faint burn scars, remnants of long, grueling nights on the training grounds. Alyssa Graves sat alone, still in her dark uniform, though the insignia had been removed. She had just finished the evening training session with a group of newly enlisted SEAL recruits. None of them knew that the petite woman teaching them sniper techniques was the very reason an entire police department and judicial system had bowed in shame just days earlier. She opened the bottom drawer, the kind of drawer only those who've looked death in the eye understand the need for. Inside, tucked between a quarter-folded old map and a yellowing strip of medical tape, was an aged handwritten letter, folded into thirds, its edges worn thin and stained with old sweat. The letter had been penned in slightly slanted, somewhat shaky handwriting on brownish military-issue paper. The writer was Sergeant Malcolm Graves, Alyssa's father, a former Marine who served in the Persian Gulf in 1991. He had sent it in 2005, when Alyssa had just completed her initial SEAL training, one of only 3 black women selected that year. "You're stepping into a world that many believe doesn't belong to you," he wrote. "They will look at your skin before they see the teammates you've saved. They will look at your hair before they ask about the wounds you've endured. But don't let them define you. A real soldier doesn't fight to be applauded. A soldier fights because the truth needs someone brave enough to stand for it." Alyssa read each line slowly, her eyelids trembling, not from weakness, but from the flood of battlefield memories crashing back like a tide. She remembered her first injury in Kunduz, a piece of shrapnel lodged near her heart, yet she kept firing to protect her team. She remembered rescuing an 8-year-old girl held hostage in Mosul. She remembered an Iraqi villager giving her an embroidered scarf, saying, "I don't know your name, but I'll always remember the eyes that protected me." Yet all those victories had been erased in a single courtroom morning, where she wasn't addressed by rank, but by suspicion. A place where she was handcuffed simply for remaining silent, simply for being a black woman in an old jacket. Alyssa folded the letter again and placed it into the left chest pocket, right where the shrapnel had once pierced her, leaving behind a scar. She exhaled quietly, then smiled. Not a triumphant smile, but the smile of someone who had just stitched up a wound that no one else could see. "I'm still fighting, Dad," she whispered, her voice hoarse from a full day of training and an entire week staring down a broken justice system. "But this time, it's on our soil." She stood up and walked out of the room, moonlight shimmering faintly across her jacket, where the faded words read, United States Navy. And across the training yard, the recruits were doing push-ups in cadence, shouting in unison, "One team! One fight!" Alyssa walked past silently, saying nothing. But every step she left on the concrete, steady, upright, resolute, carried weight. Because this time, the battle wasn't in the jungles or deserts. It was in hearing rooms, courtrooms, in archived footage, and in buried case files. And those who once believed they could remain silent without consequence were now face to face with a woman who carried not just the scars of war, but the legacy of truth. A truth no one could bury any longer. 13 days after the seismic event at Fulton Courthouse, the United States Congress convened a special hearing at the Dirksen Building in Washington, D.C. The topic listed on the Senate Judiciary Committee's official schedule was racial bias in law enforcement and judicial proceedings. But what wasn't written on paper echoed through every hallway. The Alyssa Graves case. On the very first morning, the name Alyssa Graves was mentioned 14 times by senators from both parties. The incident had been compiled into a 367-page report distributed to each attendee. Photographs were projected onto a large screen. A female service member handcuffed in a courtroom. A former SEAL sniper standing before an armored SUV, flanked by saluting officers. And finally, the image of her walking across a base field, the American flag waving behind her. No one could deny anymore the magnitude of the silence that day. Senator Elena Strauss of Minnesota, who led the Rapid Response Legislative Group, addressed the hearing in a steady, firm voice without hesitation. We are talking about a black woman who served over 14 years in the most elite special operations unit of the U.S. military, who shed blood overseas to defend human rights, and was treated like a criminal in a courtroom on her soil. If that doesn't sound the alarm, then our rule of law is already blind. Over 3 days of testimony, representatives from the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, and several civil rights organizations were called to respond to direct questioning. The internal investigation report from the Fulton Police Department was made public, revealing more than 47 civil complaints, 19 audio recordings deliberately removed from the storage system, and 7 instances where Kyle Benson was shielded from consequence by the local chief judge. A proposed bill titled the Graves Act was introduced on the second day. It included 5 main provisions, notably, an absolute ban on arresting any witness within courthouse grounds without a warrant and legal representation present, mandatory recording and archiving of all arrests, interactions, and interrogations within a 500-meter radius of any courtroom, and the formation of an independent review commission on procedural justice at the state level, chaired by former military personnel and federal judges. Human Rights Watch soon released a report supporting and recommending the Graves Act as a critical milestone in protecting military veterans from bias upon re-entry into civilian life. CNN, MSNBC, and CBS News all ran headlines young. From battlefield to courtroom, Alyssa Graves' journey forces Congress to listen. On social media, the hashtag #TheGravesAct surpassed 27 million mentions within just 72 hours. One detail that touched the public most was Alyssa's handwritten letter being printed and displayed in a glass frame along the halls of Congress, the final line standing out beneath the spotlight. "I'm still fighting, Dad. But this time, it's at home." Less than 2 weeks later, 6 states, California, New York, Colorado, Oregon, Illinois, and Georgia, simultaneously announced pilot implementations of the Graves Act principles in their local courts. But the most profound impact of this case was not found in legislation. It lay in the shift in perception that a woman in a faded jacket with dark skin is not a likely suspect. but could be someone who once stood on the edge of life and death to defend the very system now tasked with restoring her honor. And so, when Alyssa Graves' name was spoken for the 15th time during the hearing, the entire room rose. Not out of political protocol, but out of instinct. The instinct of people who understood that some battles require no weapons to be won. Only truth, spoken aloud, and truly heard. Alyssa Graves never appeared on national television. After her name shook the Senate and triggered a wave of reforms across the country, dozens of journalists made their way to the Norfolk base. CNN, CBS, BBC, even a Japanese network. But all of them left with the same answer from the duty officer. Ms. Graves does not give interviews. She's still training. In an era where every victory is live-streamed and measured in shares, Alyssa chose silence. No statement video. No gratitude post. No inspirational speech. And yet, it was that very absence that made the deepest impact. She didn't need to stand in the spotlight, because truth had already begun to shine on its own. 1 month after the hearing, during an internal training session at the Norfolk Special Operations Range, Alyssa stepped forward before 27 new SEAL recruits preparing for evaluation. They stood at attention, each one knowing exactly who she was. Some addressed her as Mom. Some quietly called her Ghost, a nickname from the Kunduz operation, where she eliminated 3 targets in 18 seconds without a trace of motion. She didn't give a long lecture. No fiery speech. She simply looked at them, her gaze steady, and said slowly, "I don't fight to be famous. I fight so that my little brothers and sisters can live in a society where justice doesn't depend on skin color." No one said anything afterward, but they stood firmer. Straight. Because they understood that the woman before them wasn't just a living legend. She was proof that doing what's right can prevail if you refuse to be silent. 3 months later, the United States Navy Museum in Washington, D.C., unveiled a new statue, cast in dark bronze, standing 2.3 meters tall, placed in the main hall beside the traditional SEAL Team 6 insignia. The statue depicted Alyssa mid-stride, coat flared by the wind, helmet in hand, her face calm, but her eyes staring forward as if piercing through time itself. At the statue's base, a steel plaque bore only one line. She was silenced, but justice heard her anyway. The unveiling wasn't televised. No government officials gave speeches, but hundreds attended, mostly veterans, military families, and those who had written letters of gratitude to her in the months prior. Among them was a 12-year-old boy named Malik from Richmond, Virginia, the grandson of a black firefighter who'd once been suspended for exposing racial discrimination by his superior. The boy stood before the statue for a long time, then asked his mother, "Mom, can I do what she did one day?" She didn't answer right away. She simply squeezed his shoulder gently and said, "If you believe in truth, and don't back down." Alyssa's story has since become curriculum in several law schools. It's used as a case study in federal judge training materials. It's the subject of senior theses in human rights programs at over 80 universities. But more importantly, it's the reason thousands of people of color who once stayed silent in the face of injustice now know how to rise, record, report, write, and speak. One person stayed silent, so millions could find their voice. Alyssa Graves never sought justice only for herself. She reignited the definition of justice, not as a robed figure on a bench, but as a woman in handcuffs still standing tall, looking power in the eye and saying, "I'm not afraid, but I will not be silent." And from that day forward, America, though still imperfect, could no longer turn its back on people like her ever again. something has finally begun to change. Join us in sharing meaningful stories by hitting the like button and subscribing. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you can start your day with lessons that matter and a deeper, more compassionate understanding of the world.